So I'm going to go off my program here just a little bit. I don't know quite how long ago it was that this idea of themes percolated in my head, but it's really, really wonderful to see the participation here, and this is exactly the sort of thing that I had in mind as I look out into the audience and I see the community and people from a variety of university departments represented here, students. This is exactly the kind of intellectual experience I was hoping to have when I came here, and so it's very gratifying to see you all show up. So thank you. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Sandor Katz to Ohio University. I want to start by thanking those who have made this possible. That would include the Food Studies Theme, the Food Matters Student Club, the Gluten-Free Alliance, and the Departments of Biological Sciences, Chemistry, and Environmental and Plant Biology. So thank you for supporting the visit in this lecture. As many of you know, our speaker is the author of Wild Fermentation and the New York Times bestseller, The Art of Fermentation. The New York Times recently referred to Sandor Katz as one of the unlikely rock stars of the American food scene. So, you know, he sort of pulls that off, I'd say, right? You'll judge in a minute, maybe. He found his way to fermentation after an education at Brown University and careers in community activism and in New York City politics. Returning to the art of fermentation, Sandor, as a food activist and a fermentation revivalist, gives us the most comprehensive guide to do-it-yourself home fermentation ever published. Sauerkraut, yogurt, pickles, kimchi, it's all compiled in the 2013 work, which was awarded a James Beard Foundation Book Award. Award-winning food journalist Michael Pollan, in his introduction to the art of fermentation, says that while Katz tells us how to make sauerkraut, he more importantly explains that to ferment is to engage with the world, or to be exact, to engage with many worlds. To ferment is to enter the invisible world of fungi and bacteria. For example, fermenting food is a stand against the homogenization of flavors and food experiences and a declaration of independence from the passive consumption of commodities. Well, you didn't come here to hear me make remarks, and so I'm going to sit down and listen and introduce our guest, Sandor Katz.
Okay, wow, a lot of people. So if people are like coming in the edge, you can send them in here. Did I turn on the mic? Okay, now I'm turning on the mic. Can you all hear me up there in the back? Okay, great. Great. Well, thank you all for coming out. I mean, how exciting to have such a big group of people. So what I'm going to do is, besides feedback, repeated feedback. What I'm going to do is just offer some general remarks and talk about fermentation from several different perspectives, but I'm going to try not to speak too long, so we can leave a big chunk of time for some interaction and to hear questions or comments. And if there's one thing that I've learned teaching people about fermentation is people have a lot of questions about it. It's this incredibly important realm of foods and beverages. Pretty much everybody in pretty much every part of the world eats and drinks products of fermentation every single day, and that's as true here in the middle of the United States as it is in any other part of the world. And yet as a result of both outsourcing most of our food production to other people and corporations and factories, and the simultaneous process of the war on bacteria and the association of bacteria primarily with danger and disease and death. Most people just have no idea what's involved in the process of fermentation and, assume that it is extremely technically demanding, that it requires a huge amount of knowledge. And, really the thrust of all of my work is to demystify it for people and to, try to, give people the incredibly simple information that they need in order to practice fermentation themselves at home. And I recognize that, not everyone's inclined to do that, but for anyone who has, the slightest interest in it, I mean, it's all really straightforward. I mean, fermentation is not rocket science. An interesting perspective is that we don't know the origins of any fermented food or beverage because they all are so ancient. And we have a rough idea of the geographic areas that the different things emerged from. But we don't know how these practices specifically began. Most of them have been made for thousands of years. So, people did not have the means that we have now to, track and regulate, for instance, temperature. People had no specific insight into microorganisms. So, really it's easier for us now to practice fermentation than, it has been historically for people in much simpler kitchen spaces. So let me just start by making sure we're all on the same page with some information. First of all, let me just see a show of hands. How many people here would say at this point in the day that they have already eaten and or drunk something fermented today? Okay, so we're getting, I'm going to say that's about half the people. So I'm just going to tick off a few, really common foods that many people eat every day that, they might not realize are fermented. So coffee is fermented. Bread is fermented. Cheese is fermented. Cured meats are fermented. So now, okay, are there any people who've just realized that they had fermented foods today that didn't realize that they had them earlier? Okay. So what brings all of these disparate foods together, what makes them all similar, is that they are produced by the action of microorganisms. So I would define fermentation broadly as the transformative action of microorganisms. If we have any biologists in the house, do we have any biology students or professors in the house? Okay, so biologists by this point are already shaking their heads, because a biologist understands fermentation to be something a little bit more specific and at the same time a little bit broader. For a biologist, fermentation means the production of energy without oxygen, anaerobic metabolism. And most of the foods and beverages that we describe as fermented are the products of anaerobic microbial processes. When we turn milk into yogurt, that's an anaerobic process that does not require oxygen. When we turn grapes into wine, that's an anaerobic process that does not require oxygen. When we turn grains into bread, that's an anaerobic process that does not require oxygen. The problem with the biologist definition from a fermented foods and beverages point of view is that there are a handful of fermented foods and beverages that do require oxygen. I think of these as the oxymoronic ferments. But some examples of this would be kombucha, the fermented sweet tea that's become so popular. You need an open vessel with access to oxygen to turn sweet tea into kombucha. Vinegar, what we use as the base of our salad dressings and condiments. Any kind of alcoholic beverage will turn to vinegar if you leave it with prolonged exposure to oxygen. So that's another aerobic process. Certain kinds of cheeses need oxygen. The Indonesian soy ferment tempeh needs oxygen. So anyway, because there are these foods that are microbially transformed that do require oxygen that everybody on the ground refers to as fermented, I prefer to work with this broader lay definition of fermentation, that it's the transformative action of microorganisms. But of course, as we all know from our kitchens, not every transformative action of microorganisms results in something delicious that we're ready to put into our mouths. And food spoilage is another kind of example of the transformative action of microorganisms. When we call our food spoiled or rotten, that's mostly what we're talking about. And we don't refer to these foods as fermented. We reserve the word fermented for intentional or desirable microbial transformations. But I think that the fact that we all inevitably discard a certain amount of food in our kitchens maybe gives us some insight into the inevitability of microbial transformation. What we now understand is that all of the plants and all of the animal products that make up our food are populated by elaborate communities of microorganisms. And the difference between disgusting, rotten, decomposing food and a food that is fermented to perfection is mostly a question of which kinds of microorganisms are growing on the food. And so, really what the practice of fermentation, amounts to is manipulations of environmental conditions so as to encourage the growth of certain types of organisms while simultaneously discouraging the growth of other types of organisms. But the organisms are there on our food, and this is the great insight that we've learned since the work of Louis Pasteur 150 years ago, is an awareness of microorganisms and awareness of their presence everywhere. And like if you've been following the news in recent years, there's a lot of new information about the microbiome. The microbiome, is the the microbiome really specifically refers to the genetics, but the genetics of this elaborate, community of microorganisms that each of us carries around as part of our bodies. It turns out that the cells of our bodies are outnumbered by something like 10 to 1 by bacteria that we're host to. And these bacteria, they're not parasites, they're not making us sick. We coexist with them perfectly well, and it turns out they provide all sorts of essential, services to us, giving us a lot of our functionality. And I think that this is one of the reasons why there's a heightened interest in, fermentation and, microbially rich foods right now, is because, after a lifetime for most of us of, the war on bacteria and just hearing about, how, dangerous bacteria are, there's, a more nuanced notion that is developing. That actually we need bacteria. Bacteria in our intestines are what enable us to effectively digest food and assimilate nutrients. Our immune system is mostly the work of these bacteria in our intestines. There's a lot of exciting new information related to neurological function and brain chemistry, that serotonin, dopamine, other chemical compounds that determine how we think and how we feel are regulated by bacteria in our guts. And really every aspect of our physiology and functionality is related to these bacteria that were really regarded as dangerous enemies until pretty much the 21st century. That's one of the reasons I think why there's really heightened interest in this right now. A lot of people are seeking out these microbially rich foods. And let me distinguish and just say, not all fermented foods are microbially rich. It all depends on what happens after the fermentation. If you go to the supermarket and you buy a can of sauerkraut, well, the sauerkraut was fermented to make the sauerkraut, but then if it's in a can, it has been heat processed after the fermentation. If you want to eat raw sourdough dough, that has live bacterial cultures, but who wants to eat raw dough? Once it goes into a hot oven, those bacteria, for the most part, perish. But a subset of fermented foods, the fermented foods that have not been cooked or heat processed after their fermentation, have these microbial communities intact, and when we eat them, they essentially help to rebuild biodiversity in the gut. They are what are described as probiotic. So I mean, that's one of the reasons why there's a heightened awareness of fermented foods. I mean, this is a very interesting issue for me. This new interest in fermented foods. I mean, the fact that so many of you are here to hear about fermented foods and talk about fermented foods. And actually, in this year, in 2015, all of the lists of food trends, fermentation is right up there, and they're calling it a food trend. Which is sort of funny, considering that so many of our basic everyday foods that have never, ever, ever for a minute waned in popularity are products of fermentation. I mean, is bread a food fad? Is wine or beer a food fad? Is cheese or cured meats or condiments a food fad? So, I mean, I think that, really, sauerkraut was probably more popular, 75 years ago than it is now. So I don't know how that could be described as a food fad. But in any case, there is this, sort of heightened awareness of it. People have been eating fermented foods all along, but they weren't really thinking about the fermentation, and they, for the most part, weren't practicing that. And another thing that I think is happening in our current period is that, after several generations of sort of full-on embrace of convenience foods, and people just being thrilled at the liberation of one-stop shopping and being able to buy foods that are already at least somewhat prepared. I think that, kind of since the turn of the millennium, there's been a growing awareness that, well, actually, the food that system is producing is nutritionally diminished, and we're seeing all of these, sort of nutrition-related disease epidemics developing. The methods, the agricultural methods, which allow one person to produce enough food for 100 people, are environmentally destructive. The removal of food production from our communities has been, economically devastating. So, for all of these reasons, I think that many people are paying more attention to food, where it comes from, how it is produced. I certainly hope that this isn't a fad, but I see the growing interest in fermentation as really a manifestation of this broader interest in where does our food come from and how is it produced. Because once you begin interrogating your food in that way, well, it turns out fermentation is just part of the picture that has largely been ignored or allowed to be practiced exclusively by specialists behind factory doors. So I've actually had the great privilege over the last couple of days of getting to meet quite a few food producers, in this local area, and hearing about the, sort of revival of the local food systems here, which seems very exciting and is not dissimilar from, revivals of local food systems that are happening, in a lot of different places around the U.S. But, I think in a place with a temperate climate and a limited growing season like this, once you start talking about reviving local food systems, like you are talking about agriculture, but you're talking beyond agriculture, because if you can only, if you're only producing, fresh food fresh plant food, vegetables for half of the year, then we have to do something with those things to enable them to feed us for the rest of the year. And so, in terms of like food preservation and feeding people throughout the year, fermentation is just an essential part of the story that makes it all work. And I would say, this goes back to the origins of agriculture. I already talked about the idea that nobody really knows the origins of any particular fermented food. Most of the speculative writing assumes that the earliest intentional practice of fermentation was the production of alcohol. But of course, it's not like humans invented alcohol or even discovered alcohol. Alcohol is simply a natural phenomenon. Anyone who's ever harvested a lot of berries, sometimes you pick a berry and you can taste that it's already fermenting. It happens without us. And there's lots of interesting documentation of insects and birds and different kinds of animals who are drawn to the smell of fermenting fruit. As well as lots of interesting documentation of animals becoming inebriated by gorging themselves on fermented fruits. And also, we evolved with enzymes to digest alcohol. I mean, this suggests that alcohol was, sort of something that was present in our evolutionary past, and that our evolutionary forebears, were, at least periodically familiar with this phenomenon. But, the unique step that the human culture, took with alcohol is that, we figured out how to make it. We created technology like pottery vessels to be able to contain liquids and ferment beverages in them. And nobody knows exactly when that started. I mean, the oldest surviving pottery shards are about, with residue of wine, are about 9,000 years old from China, but presumably the earlier vessels, before the emergence of pottery, were things like gourds or, hollowed out pieces of wood, things that, wouldn't last for 9,000 years, that would biodegrade. So we don't really know, when the beginnings of the practice were. Claude Lévi-Strauss, who is who was an anthropologist and cultural theorist of the 20th century. I mean, he saw, the idea of making alcohol as the original act of culture. And that he sort of pictures a band of pre-human hominoids, walking through the forest and coming across a beehive full of honey that's washed out of a tree. Now, honey, as many of you probably have noticed, could sit in your pantry for 20 years, and nothing happens to it. It won't ferment. But as soon as it gets diluted with water, there's already yeast in honey, and it will just start to bubble and ferment. So Claude Lévi-Strauss is picturing, this hive full of honey that's like fallen to the ground in a storm, gotten all wet, and there's like a puddle of honey water. And it's kind of bubbly and it smells good. So he's like imagining, people getting down on the ground and like, tasting it. Oh, it tastes good. And they like drink up this puddle, and then they have like a nice light feeling. And, it was a natural phenomenon. So who knows if these people are ever going to encounter such a thing again in their lives. But the act of culture, he describes, is when people climb up into the tree, take the hive down, add water and dilute it in some sort of a vessel, and he calls the vessel is the cultural object. It's the first cultural object, and the process of making mead in it, is the first act of culture. Who knows? It's totally speculative, but kind of interesting. But then thinking about the origins of agriculture. I mean, is agriculture possible without fermentation? Like, can a people invest all of their energy into crops that are ready at a certain moment of the year if they don't have in mind strategies for how they're going to use those crops to feed them through the rest of the year? So I would argue that agriculture really is not possible without fermentation. I don't mean to suggest that food preservation is the only practical benefit of fermentation. I mean, the thing about fermentation versus food spoilage is that you have this invisible life force that we now understand is present on all of the plants and animal products that make up our food. If we do nothing to sort of guide those organisms, typically the food will rot in some way, or decompose, or turn into something that nobody would find desirable. But all around the world, people channeled this life force on the food by manipulating environmental conditions in order to derive practical benefits, including not only preservation, but digestibility, So, I mean, a lot of the thinking about, for instance, like gluten intolerance and how, wheat has, become such a widespread problem. I mean, one of the ideas is that, well, okay, when you ferment wheat with bacteria, it breaks down the gluten. Until Louis Pasteur isolated yeast, there never was a loaf of bread that existed that was fermented only by yeast without also simultaneously being fermented by bacteria. Breaking down many complex nutritional compounds and potentially toxic compounds, but also breaking down gluten. But now, the vast majority of bread that people eat is fermented exclusively by yeast. So this is the idea of isolating a singular microorganism. This is an invention of microbiology. In the natural world, you never find any kind of singular organism. You never find yeast alone. You never find a particular type of bacteria alone. Microorganisms exist in elaborate communities, and the question of which of them will thrive is purely environmental, and it just depends on environmental conditions. Okay, I was talking about practical benefits we derive from fermentation. Also detoxification. I mean, there are all kinds of foods around the world that cannot be eaten without fermentation. They're potentially dangerous. I mean, the most dramatic one would be cassava. The tropical tubers that, basically people all around the equator, use as a primary source of food. But cassava grown in certain soils, notably in West Africa, have extraordinarily high levels of cyanide. And if people were to try to just eat cassava roots without processing them, they would kill them. So, the culture that has emerged is to peel the cassava, chop it up, soak it in water. Anytime you take a dry food and soak it in water, you're initiating fermentation. Basically, the reason why dried foods are so stable is not that they aren't covered with microorganisms, but rather that the microorganisms, lack the water that they need in order to function. All life needs water. It's the most basic precondition of life. And so, whether it's a grain or a bean or something that started out wet that you dry, like, beef jerky or fruit leather, it's the process of drying it that enables the food to be preserved simply by depriving the microorganisms that are part of it of the water that they need in order to function. So anyway, I mean, with cassava, it's an incredibly simple process. As almost all fermentation processes, are incredibly simple. So a final practical benefit, other than preservation, improved digestibility and nutrient assimilation, detoxification, and the live cultures themselves, would be flavor. Fermentation creates strong flavors, compelling flavors. Not everybody loves every flavor of fermentation, and some of them can be extremely strong. But when you learn to appreciate them, you really crave them. You love them. I mean, really, you walk into a gourmet food store anywhere and look around and think about the nature of the foods that we put in these stores, that we put on a pedestal, that people ship around the world and pay exorbitant prices for. And they're almost all products of fermentation. I sometimes do a visualization walking through this gourmet food store in the neighborhood in New York City where I grew up. And you walk in, and the first thing you see are olives. Has anyone here ever tried to eat a raw olive off of an olive tree? Yeah, I mean, it's horribly bitter. It's even toxic, but you would never eat enough of them because they taste so awful to experience toxicity. So olives are always cured. curing is this sort of big, vague word of any kind of, post-harvest ripening of anything or maturation of anything. So, firewood, it needs to be cured. Sweet potatoes are cured. But olives need to be cured, and there's many different ways of curing olives. Not all of them involve fermentation, but most of them, and certainly the simplest methods of curing olives, involve a simple lactic acid salt water fermentation. Then you turn around and there's just crazy mountains of cheese, and not every cheese is fermented. You can make extremely fresh cheeses like farmer's cheese and things like that don't involve fermentation, but almost all cheeses are fermented, and certainly any cheese with any strong flavor, or a runny texture are products of fermentation. Then what do you put cheese on? Bread is all fermented. If bread wasn't fermented, it would be like a brick. I mentioned earlier that coffee is fermented. So is chocolate. So is vanilla. So are certain styles of tea. Cured meats involve fermentation. Condiments. Either they're directly fermented, like soy sauce and fish sauce, or almost all of the other ones that aren't directly fermented rely upon vinegar, this product of fermentation, in order to stabilize them. And that would be the story of, mustard, ketchup, mayonnaise, salsa, chutney, and so many others. So anyway, fermentation also creates strong flavors, and there's lots of sort of extreme examples. I've had a couple of occasions to try this, Swedish fermented fish called surströmming, which is, it's kind of notorious. And certain fermented foods like surströmming, it's sort of assumed that only people who grow up around them are going to like them. And then, of course, those people love to offer them to visitors because, it's sort of fun to watch someone who, can't even swallow something that you think is really delicious. And I mean, it's interesting for me because, through, a repeat exposure, now 3 experiences of trying surströmming, it's really grown on me. And a lot of strong flavors have. I mean, I would say until about 10 years ago, I was kind of put off by the smell of strong, stinky cheeses. And now, if I can smell a cheese from 100 feet away, it just piques my interest and makes me want to taste it. And yet I've bought pieces of cheese like that and invited friends over to share it with me, and had them stop at the door and say, "Did something die inside your house?" And they would just never for a minute consider putting that into their mouth. So I think in general we could say that the products of fermentation create flavors that are largely acquired tastes. And not everybody likes every flavor of fermentation. Sometimes the question comes up, which I think is very interesting, of, where is the line between, fermentation and rotten food? And, you know it when you see it, but you might not see it the same way that, someone who grew up in the Arctic would. Just because they've grown up eating, fermented fish as a staple food. That is actually the singular food practice that's enabled people to, survive in that harsh environment. And how do children there learn to like that? Well, it's what they see their parents and their grandparents eating, and they're around the smell of it. And I don't know if the first time a small Inuit child tastes fermented fish, whether they're just like, yeah, that's the best thing I've ever had in my life, or whether they just have to learn to love it or learn to like it because that's what there is. But anyway, think about your first taste of coffee. Think about your first taste of beer. Think about your first taste of like a strong flavored cheese. And, these really are, strong flavors that require acculturation. And as for that sort of dividing line between, what is fermented and what is rotten, I mean, it is largely culturally, it's culturally determined subjectivity. And people have very, very different notions of what's appropriate to eat. which leads to the question of safety. I think a lot of the, sort of knee-jerk reaction to strong flavored foods is like something must be wrong with this. In fact, whether it's strong, has a strong smell or flavor or not, what I've learned is that many people project just a generalized fear of bacteria onto fermentation, or a generalized fear of food preservation. Because it's just in the cultural imagination. What can anyone name? What's the worst food poisoning agent of them all? Botulism, right? So I mean, I can't tell you how many people at sauerkraut making workshops have been like, how can I be sure I'm getting the good bacteria that I want, the lactic acid bacteria, and that I'm not going to get botulism from my sauerkraut, I don't want to make anyone sick, and I definitely don't want to kill anyone, and how would I know? I don't have a laboratory, I'm not a microbiologist, even if I could see the bacteria, I wouldn't know what I was looking for. So, so people assume that like you need a lot of information to do this. Well, just in terms of safety, let me tell you what I've learned from this fellow who I've gotten to know, who's a microbiologist for the USDA and specifically works with the vegetable fermentation and pickling industries, helping them solve technical problems. But according to the USDA, the number of food poisoning cases that have been documented from fermented vegetables since the beginning of collecting data like this is exactly 0. So there's no case history of illness from this food. We hear every year about people getting sick from raw vegetables and raw fruits. I mean, clearly there's the possibility of contamination, whether it's, a manure from a factory farm uphill that runs over a field, or whether it's just, sloppy handling and, lack of, hygiene practices at the, critical moments. So contamination happens. But if you took, vegetables or fruits that had been contaminated in that kind of way and fermented them, well, the indigenous population of organisms is always going to dominate over, introduced contaminants. And as they acidify the environment in the case of vegetables, or as alcohol develops in the case of fruits, the acids and the alcohol will knock out the contaminating bacteria, which is what makes sort of fermentation such an effective strategy for food safety. So there's really no reason to approach fermentation or fermented foods with fear. I think it's always good to sort of keep your critical judgment functioning. If something smells really awful, don't eat it just because I told you that there haven't been any documented cases of food poisoning from fermented vegetables. I mean, there are things that can go wrong, but they're always abundantly obvious. They're things that you can see with your eyes. It's not like invisible bacteria. It might be, okay, so here's the worst case scenario that's happened to me a few times from failing to adequately protect the food that I was fermenting from flies buzzing around in the kitchen, is I opened them up and there were maggots crawling out of them. So, okay, so that's visible. That's not an invisible killer. That's an experience that I've learned from. To tie a string around it in the summertime to keep the flies from going up there. So anyway, I mean, I could go on, and I will, but I'd rather do it in a more interactive way, and see, I mean, and I'm really open to questions about the mold growing on the surface of your sauerkraut, or health questions, or more philosophical questions, or anything that's on your mind. So, is sprouting a form of fermentation? No. No, I mean, sprouting is, sprouting is germination. So sprouting is just, the dormant seed, having the conditions of water and oxygen and sort of the seedling emerging out of it. Now, with that, you can ferment. I mean, you can certainly put like mung bean sprouts, into your sauerkraut, which I've done many times and is really delicious. Or, of course, beer. Does anyone know what you have to do to barley before you can turn it into beef, before you can ferment it into beer? Malted. So malting is just sprouting. Malting is just a sort of specific word used in beer making to describe sprouting or germination. So, what happens is if you just try to spontaneously ferment, barley, what you're going to get is an acidic fermentation, and you could make like a sour barley porridge. And by the way, sour porridges, sour gruels have been, a really important part of, our culinary legacies in many different parts of the world, and are still, very, very important in many parts of the world, and can be very delicious, but it's not beer. So in order to turn a grain into a beverage with a significant amount of alcohol, what you have to do is break down starches, complex carbohydrates, into simple sugars, simple carbohydrates. And there are three ways that human cultures have done that. The most ancient way that is still practiced in a few different regions around the world makes use of enzymes that we all produce. Amylase enzymes that break down starches into sugar that are in our saliva. And so there are traditions of chewing grains and saturating them with our saliva to break down starches into fermentable sugars and make alcoholic beverages. The way that we do it in the Western tradition of beer making is using malting, germination, and same thing. The germination basically breaks down the complex carbohydrates of the seed into simple carbohydrates, in order to feed the emerging seedling. But if you stop the process, before the seedling emerges, then you've just broken down the starches into sugars, and that enables you to make alcohol. And the third way, which is practiced, across Asia, most widely known in our part of the world via sake, the Japanese fermented rice beverage, but it's practiced in distinctive ways in every part of Asia. And actually, just this winter, I met indigenous people in Costa Rica who use a similar method, but it involves growing molds. So there are molds, most notably aspergillus molds, but other kinds of molds that produce enzymes that break down starches into sugars. And actually, koji, the Japanese version of these molded grains that are used for making sake, as well as soy sauce and miso, has been so thoroughly investigated, and the enzymes that it produces, the quite varied enzymes that it produces, have been tapped by food industries. And most notably, you can't make high fructose corn syrup without koji-derived enzymes. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to say that no, sprouting is not fermentation. See, I told you I could go on.
You touched on safety. There are some associations with certain fermented foods and less obvious than botulism, kind of disease, stomach cancer, and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. There's a little bit of epidemiology, mostly coming out of East Asia, associating high consumption of salty fermented vegetables with gastric and esophageal cancers. But what's really interesting to me, like sort of reading this article that's like was a review of this research, is that the highest levels of these cancers were in people who ate almost exclusively fermented vegetables, and to the exclusion of fresh vegetables. And once it was in the context of a more balanced diet where people are eating fresh vegetables as well as salty fermented vegetables, there is absolutely no increase in these cancers. So, I mean, just as a more general point, I would say Just because something is good does not mean that more of it is better. And while I think that fermented vegetables are great, I mean, I would really, really urge you to not eat them to the exclusion of fresh vegetables.
If you were going to make fermented vegetables in a quart jar, and with water, what's the least amount of salt you could use to have it ferment?
0. So the question is, like, if you're making a small amount, a quart-sized jar, of fermented vegetables, what's the least amount of salt you could use? And the answer is 0. I mean, if you use 0 salt, it's not going to taste very good, and it's certainly not going to have a very pleasing texture. But I mean, I would say that, like, salt enhances it in many different ways. But so you have to understand that the received tradition, your grandma who learned from her grandma who learned from her grandma, like, it was all about survival. Fermented vegetables were less about pleasure and more about survival through a long, harsh winter. And if you're preparing a barrel of sauerkraut or kimchi, and as you're preparing it that these are the only vegetables you're going to have access to for the next 6 or 8 months, well, you have an incentive to use a lot of salt. And so, this also relates to your question, but, a lot of the received tradition in places where salt was easily available and plentiful was extremely salty products. But, like, it doesn't need to be that salty. And so, if you're making it for if you're making it because you want, like, health benefits from it, or just because you want the flavor enjoyment of it, like, there's no necessity to use a lot of salt. I would say, I just encourage people in general to salt to taste, and don't be a slave to any particular, proportion of salt. I mean, I can tell you, the USDA will recommend 2.25% salt. I consider that to be too salty. Most of the contemporary, small businesses making sauerkraut that I encounter are using somewhere around 1.5% salt. But, especially if you have, like, a blood pressure problem or a hypertension problem, or you're just worried about salt for other reasons, a 0.5% of salt will really give you a lot of the benefits of salt in terms of, crispiness and slowing down the process. I mean, salt is definitely beneficial to the process. There's actually a brand of sauerkraut that's been available, for at least 20 years nationally, coming out of Santa Cruz, California, called Rejuvenative Foods, that doesn't use any salt in their sauerkraut. It doesn't taste very good. It's mushy. But it can be done. Like, the salt is certainly not the source of the cultures. The lactic acid bacteria will dominate with or without salt. The first thing salt does is it crisps up the vegetables. What makes vegetables crispy are pectins, and salt hardens pectins. So you get a much, crunchier, crisper flavor, texture by adding salt. Salt slows down the process, and when your objective is preservation, slowing down the process is actually very, very helpful. Salt also helps create a selective environment. It narrows the range of what can grow, but the lactic acid bacteria will dominate even without salt. I just don't think that salt is essential. I prefer to use, like, unrefined salts that aren't just sodium chloride, but are sodium chloride along with lots of other trace minerals, although you can work with any kind of salt you have in your kitchen. And I just like to salt very lightly and to taste. Yeah, sure. I sent in a sample I have a little poster that I got from the American Gut Project. I don't really have the analytic tools to, like, understand it, but I'm a little bit, like, at the edge of the, like, American sample, but I don't know how significant that is. Wait, the general what?
The general industry standard of the 8-month Best Buy or sell-by, and if that's actually a reality thing, or if somebody just picked it and everybody started using it.
Yeah, I mean, Best Buy dates are, if you're going to produce a food product, you have to put a date on there. And, all the small manufacturers who I talk to, when that subject comes up, they're like, oh, we didn't know what to put. I mean, in a full jar, in the refrigerator, a salty, acidic food, should be fine 5 years later. I mean, there's nothing specific that's going to degrade it. Now, it's all different if you're in a half-full jar. And as I'm sure many of you have observed in your refrigerators with things that are not sauerkraut, maybe with jams, maybe with yogurt, anything that sits in there in a half-full jar for a long time will start to mold. And that's just a function of oxygen and the fact that the jar is half full with oxygen. So with sauerkraut or with yogurt or with jam, like if you want to prolong the life of any food, consolidate it into a smaller jar where there's less airspace. No, a few years ago, I was in Vermont teaching a workshop at a farm that has a fermentation business, the Flack family farm. And Doug Flack disappeared into his cellar, and he brought me up some 3-year-old kimchi that had never been in a refrigerator. It had just been in his cellar for 3 years. And it was great. I couldn't tell the difference between that and something that was 3 months old. A salty, acidic food in a cool environment just can be stable for a very, very long period of time.
Any words of wisdom from someone wanting to go into sour beers?
Sour beers, yeah, send me some. That's fine. So, okay. The typical palate for beer, just because, until the last decade, all the beers that were commercially available for generations were beers that were fermented with a pure yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or there's a couple of other yeasts that the brewers use. And that's really a departure from the history of beer making, until that point. So here's just, my perspective on alcoholic beverages, because often I talk to people who get interested in fermentation for health benefits. And, their perspective is often like, alcohol, bad, sauerkraut, good. I think that that's a little bit of an oversimplification. And, my perspective is that, alcoholic beverages produced through wild fermentation, and wild fermentation is the title of my first book about fermentation, but I didn't make it up, and it's found throughout the literature, and it simply describes fermentation based on, organisms that are part of the food or to a limited degree from the air. When you make a wine, like, there's this sort of new natural winemaking movement where, they're actually not adding, yeast or anything. And, all the yeast, you never add a starter to sauerkraut either because it's, all the bacteria you need is on the cabbage. When you make wine, all the yeast you need is on the grapes. And so if you just, if you mash up the grapes, let the juice, sit on the grape skins for, a few hours or a few days, that community of organism, the yeasts, along with the bacteria, will start growing in that grape juice and ferment it into wine. Beer isn't so straightforward. And the reason why beer isn't so straightforward is because you have to brew it. You have to cook it. And so, whatever kind of, organisms were, on the grain to begin with, like if you just grind up the barley and, and add water, you'll certainly get bubbling and bacterial action. That's what a sourdough is, not generally with barley, with wheat, or with rye, but you could do it just as well with barley. But once you malt the grain and then put it in an oven to stop that, and then, mash your beer and then boil your wort, and then, and then it cools down, then you have to introduce, a starter in some way. And, one way they do this, what some of the Belgian breweries have done all along, is, empty the wort into what they call a cool ship. A cool ship would be like a shallow tank, maybe 6 inches high, with a broad surface area. I mean, the one that I saw, in the attic of a brewery in Brussels was like the size of this auditorium. And so, they'll basically, bring the wort, after it's done brewing into that so it can cool, And then, yeast from the air just lands on it. But yeast isn't in the air in the same concentrations everywhere. So, it turns out that the river valley of Belgium, which, where this particular practice was done, was a cherry growing region. And so, because there were all of these cherry trees, it became associated with this, really good beer. But of course, thanks to intensive real estate development, most of the cherry orchards there are gone. And so the guy at this brewery that I visited said at this point he thinks it's just because it's in the structure of the building. And if his building were ever to burn down, he'd never be able to reproduce the results that he has in any other kind of a building. Some other methods that people, and by the way, there's some brewers around the US who are doing that, and in general, you can only do that in the cooler parts of the year. In the warmer parts of the year, you end up with sort of much more bacterial growth and not nearly enough yeast growth. I've met a few people in the last couple of years who are doing work that one of them calls himself a yeast bioprospector. And he goes onto farms and different places and just, will sort of like take samples of, different fruits and off of the barks of different trees and then culture them out and then try making little batches of beer. And has really like identified quite a few, sort of distinctive, microbial communities that make really nice beer. So there are like a bunch of, people who are trying to, cultivate, sort of distinctive mixed culture beer cultures. I mean, another approach is like a very traditional approach that I know that like in the, in Tequino, the corn beer of northern Mexico, and in some of the sorghum beers of Africa, what they do is simply use the same vessel over and over again. And so the vessel itself becomes a vehicle for perpetuating the cultures. In Scandinavia, the brewer would always have a stick and use the same stick and not wash it to stir them. So, there's all these different, possible methods of perpetuating the mixed cultures. I'm certainly, personally enjoying the sort of, wider palette of flavors that I'm finding in sour beers, and I really like them. But just to get back to the point that I was making before, like traditional beers, traditional wines made with wild fermentation are no less probiotic than sauerkraut and yogurt. And anything with mixed cultures that has lactic acid bacteria is going to be full of probiotic strains as well. Are you signaling that I need to begin to wrap up? Can I do like two more questions?
Speaking of beer, we have products to
Okay, can I?
So we'll take one more question.
Okay. Oh my God, I hate this moment. Then I'll be sitting out there and I can answer some more questions. Okay, who's got a really burning question? Okay.
What about refried beans? Is there any fermentation involved in refried beans? Is that something where people cook on it?
Yeah, no, I don't think they're refried beans. I mean, there is no food that could not be fermented. Let me take a moment and just talk about some bean ferments, okay? Because there are a lot of different ways that the beans are fermented. But to the best of my knowledge, refried beans is not one of them. But soy sauce. I mean, actually, our English word soy comes from the Japanese word shoyu, because that was the sort of first introduction of soybeans to the Western world, was through the importation of soy sauce. This incredible. I mean, if there's one food that sort of exemplifies this sort of concept of umami flavor, it would be soy sauce. So that's a really important fermented food that, by the way, involves the action of molds, yeasts, and bacteria. So it's just like a particularly, microbially complex ferment. Closely related to soy sauce would be miso and other kinds of soybean pastes. And these are all things where you cook the beans and then you introduce some sort of a culture. Then there are the ones where you ferment the beans raw. So an example of that would be the South Indian pancakes called dosa, and steam breads called idli, and those are like so simple. I mean, you just take some lentils and some rice and you soak them in water and leave them at least overnight, and then blend them into a batter, add a little bit of salt, give them on a warm day just a few hours, and a cold day maybe up to 24 hours, and then they'll visibly rise, and then you make a bread like that. Then there's a very similar Afro-Brazilian ferment called acarajé, where you do the same thing with black-eyed peas. You basically soak black-eyed peas, blend them into a batter, let that ferment for a short time, and then in the Brazilian expression, they're deep fried into these fry breads, and in the West African expression, they're typically wrapped in a leaf and steamed into steam breads, the same kind of batter. Now, across West Africa, people enjoy condiments based on the fermentation of different leguminous tree seeds. I mean, the name that I have in my head is a Yoruba name, Dawa Dawa, but there's like dozens of different names. Sambula is a Senegalese name for it, and then that one microbially has a lot in common with a Japanese ferment called natto. And natto is the soybean ferment that has never really caught on in the West, because natto develops this sort of like mucilaginous coating on the beans, and it's an example of an alkaline ferment. It doesn't produce acids or alcohol, but it makes the beans more alkaline, and it gives them a sort of ammonia-like aroma that many people who haven't been exposed to this earlier in their lives find kind of scary and off-putting. So these are a few. Oh, and then it's so funny because up until last year, I would always say that it's interesting that there's so much fermentation of beans in Asia and in Africa, but not really in Europe. And then so this Italian guy came up to me and said farinata. And farinata is basically just like chickpea flour mixed into a batter, allowed to ferment for some hours, and then you make little crepes of them. There is no food that cannot be fermented. If you wanted to, innovate a, fermented refried beans, I'm sure it could be done, but I don't believe that is the practice anywhere. Okay, I want to just leave everyone with, one thought, and that is that, I've been focusing on, the sort of literal connotations of fermentation as the transformative action of microorganisms in foods and beverages, but I just want to point out that the word fermentation comes from a Latin word fervere, which means to boil, and it's because the action of fermentation in liquids is the production of bubbles, just like the action of boiling. And so, in terms of visual appearance, the processes have always been likened to one another. And in fact, the word yeast comes from Greek zestos, which also means to boil. So our vocabulary all comes from boiling. But there's this, important metaphorical use of the word fermentation. And, people will talk about, it's a period of great cultural ferment in this part of the world, or political ferment, social ferment, intellectual ferment, spiritual ferment. These are just things I've collected from reading newspapers and listening to the radio. But this metaphorical sense of the word fermentation has to do with bubbles, except that instead of, carbon dioxide in fermenting liquids, the bubbles are people excited about ideas. And so I just sort of, want to leave you with this idea that, in addition to being this important mode of transformation for foods and beverages, fermentation is also an engine of social change. And so, I hope my bubbliness about this topic, spreads out a little bit and makes some of you bubbly about this, or whatever you're bubbly about. Think of yourself as a starter culture, and inoculate the people around you with the seeds of your starter culture, and spread the ideas that make you excited. And I thank you for your interest tonight, and I'll be sitting out there. And thank you for inviting me.